Attention on deck. Thank you. Please take your seats. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the 25th Commandant of the U.S. Coast Guard, Admiral Paul Zukunft.
Well, please join me in welcoming the 5th Secretary of Homeland Security. But before I do, first and foremost, he served 45 years with the United States Marine Corps. In fact, we were out together in Seattle for the commissioning of the Douglas Monroe. And when he first walked into the ceremonial entrance, you almost thought he was passing a crucifix. But he did pay homage to Douglas Monroe because, you know, Douglas Monroe's final words were, "Did they get off?" And every Marine to this day still remembers service before self of Douglas Monroe. So our relationship with our Secretary goes back a number of years when he was the commander of Southcom, and now he leads the 3rd largest component in the federal government as the Secretary of Homeland Security. And I'm just honored to introduce the Secretary of the United States Coast Guard, General John Kelly. Thank you.
Commandant, thanks so much. Probably the most important thing I'm here to do is to do a few Q&As, but I do want to make a few comments. I don't have to read about to you who you are and what you do. What an unbelievable institution you're in. Very proud to say this, my father-in-law, now deceased, was an Iwo Jima Marine, Saipan and Tinian as well. And then at the end of World War II, got out and went in the United States Coast Guard Reserve, and he did that for many, many, many years until he retired as a senior chief. And of all of the things he talked about, he talked more about the Coast Guard and the great times and the great men and women. He was in Governor's Island at the time, but he's a port security guy, firearms and the whole bit. He was a cop in his other life. But he talked about the Coast Guard much, much more than he talked about the Marine Corps. Now, frankly speaking, the Marine Corps time was pretty horrific in terms of what he had to go through. I'll also, as a retired Marine, tell you that when I would walk on other military bases, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, or Army, Navy, and Air Force, I would typically get at least one time as I'd be walking by someone would go, you know, URAS or a Semper Fi, and they'd be there in an Army uniform or something. And obviously they were a Marine, so I'd stop and chat with them a little bit and say, well, what do you think of the Army, Navy, Air Force, whatever? And they'd always say, well, sir, you know, I should have stayed in the Marines. I really loved it. And, you know, invariably they'd say something like that. But I went aboard Berthoff down off of Panama some years ago. And I was actually seated in the mess decks with some members of the Coast Guard, but 2 or 3 of them had been in the Marine Corps. So I said, well, that's interesting. And it kind of, you know, pains me as a Marine to say this. I said, hey, well, what do you think of the Coast Guard? You know, got them aside, what do you think of the Coast Guard? And they said, you know, sir, I love the Marine Corps, but I love the Coast Guard too. And no second thoughts is my point. So, and I've always, through the years, thought that the mentality, the point of view that our 2 services, the Marine Corps and the Coast Guard, very similar. You know, we're proud of being small but mighty and ready to go, so the way we think about each other, the way we think about our service is very similar, I think, although I've never been in the Coast Guard, but I think is very similar to the way Marines. I'll tell you a story about Monroe. I was standing in for the Commandant of the Marine Corps in 2000, I think, in 4, roughly. 2003, no, it was 2002. I was on the way just before we invaded Iraq, but I was asked if I wouldn't go down to Guadalcanal for the 60th anniversary, and I was a colonel, 1-star select, if I wouldn't go down to Guadalcanal and represent the Commandant of the Marine Corps at the 60th anniversary, and I was thrilled to do it, and landed in a place called Henderson Field that the Marines, of course, cut out of the jungle there. It's been upgraded, as you might imagine. But I met there probably about 35 or 40, mostly veterans, Marine veterans of the Guadalcanal campaign. And I'm not kidding. And I just tagged onto them and walked around with them for 4 or 5 days. But they all wanted to go to the beach that Coast Guardsman Monroe, and I don't say this lightly, in fact, the only time in the history of the United States Marine Corps that we will ever admit to have been rescued is by the United States Coast Guard off of Guadalcanal. Yeah. And of course, all of those veterans, you know, none of them had been there, but they all knew the story of how the Coast Guardsman Monroe rescued, you know, really hundreds of Marines that day. And of course, you all know better than I do what he said as his last dying words, did they get off? So I thank you for that. Then I'll end my Monroe stories. I was invited by the Commandant, went down to Key West, and they were christening the Evans. And there were actually 2 World War II veterans that had been on the beach taken off by Monroe and Evans. And they were thrilled to be there. I won't tell you the beer story, but they were thrilled to be there. And the connection from my service through those 2 men, old as they were, to the United States Coast Guard, to me, was very, very meaningful. So anyways, thrilled to be here, thrilled to be your secretary. Before I take some questions or whatever, I would just tell you that I don't know why I'm here relative to how I got this job. I tell the story because it's kind of a fun story for me anyways. I did not know Donald Trump before I received a phone call in November from his chief of staff. I don't know anyone that knows Donald Trump at the time. I don't know how he got my name. And I literally got a phone call, a cold phone call from Reince Priebus, who I didn't know who he was, and I didn't know that any human being would have a name like that. But he convinced me after a few minutes. As I say, I thought it was one of my kind of jerk retired friends that. And he said, no, I really am who, you know, the president-elect's chief of staff, and he'd really like to see you and interview you for your job if you'd be willing to do that. And we were watching with my wife college football that Saturday afternoon, and he said, we'll send an airplane down for you and bring you up to New Jersey. And I said, well, I'm not a send an airplane down for you kind of guy. I said, if you're serious, I'll drive up tomorrow. And he said, oh, you don't drive, we'll send an airplane. I said, no, that's kind of not who I am. So I drove up the next day anyways, and he said, we talked for about an hour and more or less said, I'd like you to come on board. So I said, I'd be happy to. When I hung up on that phone call, though, I was sitting on the couch with my wife. I'd been 45 and a half years in the Marine Corps, moved 27 times, 3 kids, 2 of them in the Marine Corps, and 8 months retired. And like most of us, I told my wife, my spouse, you can pick the place we're going to retire, you can pick the house, and then I'll do whatever you tell me to do after that. So 8 months in the job, so I hung up and I think I'm going to get offered a job. And she said to me literally, we were laughing about it the other night, in fact, she said, well, if the Kelly family is nothing else, we're a family of service. So if they think they need you, you ought to go. She said, besides, all of this quality time we've been spending together. In fact, we were talking about this the other night, and she literally said, the most miserable 8 months of my life. So anyways, but anyways, here I am, and I have found it to be, to say the least, a unique experience. It's very, very different. than anything I've done before. I'd certainly worked with civilians before, but it's a very different lifestyle and attitude outside of the service. They're wonderful, wonderful people in DHS, to say the least. Well, we're all in DHS. But the things I've had to learn are the differences between how a military service, and that includes the civilians that are in the service as well, how they look at their day-to-day jobs and how other elements within the federal government look at their jobs. I've been shocked about the political differences between, when you're in uniform, they may argue as to whether you should get, 8 or 9 national security cutters or this airplane or that airplane, but they never, in my experience as a Marine, I worked the Hill quite a bit, they never, doubted whether you should have a national security cutter, as an example, but just how many, or how many you should get within what frame of. The world I live in now is unbelievably political because the issues that I deal with, are pretty emotional issues, immigration and things like that. So those are the two differences I've learned, is the politics of the thing. And the other thing is the media. In uniform, I would say that for the most part, articles written about the services, the 5 services, tend to be, maybe 80%, accurate. They never write the story you want to read about yourself, right? But at least if they're semi-accurate, you say, okay, that's a responsible story. By contrast, in the job I'm in now, about 10%. If it's 10% accurate, it's a pretty good story. And it's kind of depressing because now, in their defense, we have not, it became apparent to me that the last administration, I don't mean Jay Johnson in the DHS team, I mean, in general, the last administration were not very cooperative with the press. They wanted to control the message at the White House, which is impossible. So I think we didn't have a real outreach in public affairs. And the other thing would be the House and Senate as well. We didn't, they wanted to control that message as well on Capitol Hill. That's not a criticism. That's every president's prerogative to do those kind of things. But you lose a lot when you don't interact with the press, and certainly you lose a lot when you don't go up and engage on the Hill. And I don't have to tell this organization about the importance of the Hill. So those are kind of my opening comments and where I am. Where do we want to go with the final kind of point with the department? It's simply this. There are many, many things. 15 years the department has been in functioning. And Jay, Secretary Johnson, friend of mine, I think he started this unity of effort, unity of command issue that makes all the sense in the world to me. People told me when I got to the job that, well, DHS is very, very made up of a very unique organization, very disparate. The Coast Guard's very different than the Secret Service, and that's very different than this or that. But the more I've learned about this organization, DHS, in comparison to, say, DOD, the DOD is very, very broken up as well. I mean, the Army is totally different than the Navy, which is totally different than the Marine Corps, and the Office of Secretary of Defense, 3,000 or so people at odds, very different than the Joint Staff, which is very different than the service staffs. Then you have DLA, Defense Logistics Agency, which is super different than NSA. You get the point. But they do have one unifying mission, defend the homeland in the away game, right? So, but we have one mission as a department, that is defend the homeland in the home game. So we do have a unifying mission. We have very disparate parts, but there are some things I think that we could do. I think we have in the department 19 different pay systems, 19 different personnel systems. It's crazy. So my point is, where it makes sense, we're going to be looking at continuing Jay Johnson's effort to do things in a meaningful way. I was just talking to one of the law enforcement agencies, and they were saying we need a new specialized rifle, and we want to research and develop one. And I'm a kind of a gun guy. There's probably 10,000 rifles made all over the world on the market today. I bet one of them is going to fit their needs. So, but there's the point. We tend to go out and R&D things, that are, you know, I mean, I can remember the money wasted in my own time in the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps and the Army wanted to buy new trucks, so we both, I mean, how different can the trucks be, right? So, but we both went out, we both R&D'd our own, spent all that money. You know, the Army buys 50,000 of everything, the Marine Corps buys 6,000 of things. Total waste of money. So the point is, anyways, where we can find common things to do and unify, but by no means to say that we're going to do it in an irrational way. I think there's some, particularly in the more civilian side, things like pay systems, personnel systems, some acquisition issues make sense, but we'll do that in a very measured way. So I think, Commandant, if it's all right, I'll end there and open it up for whatever questions, and if I can't answer them, I'll do the best I can to pick someone out of the front, maybe the vice, and he can do that. So, questions?
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. For the question and answer session, please stand up, and one of the roving microphone ushers will bring the microphone to you. We ask you hold off on your question until you have the microphone for the benefit of those watching via live stream.
There's one.
Good afternoon, Mr. Secretary. Kevin Jones with the Arctic Policy Office. And first off, I want to say thanks for the opportunity to have this town hall. Excuse me. So understand the department's going to be coming out with your Arctic strategy here shortly, so we're looking forward to that. So the national strategy on the Arctic region was signed back in 2013, and I was wondering, do you have a sense on where the administration is going to go with the if they're going to change the national, excuse me, national strategy or not, or if, or what the sense of what Mr. Trump will do?
Well, I would tell you that the president, without joking, I mean, he could find the Arctic on the globe, and understands, now all kidding aside, understands how important the Arctic is and is becoming for a whole host of reasons. By the way, I mean, he is very much a homeland security guy. He's almost obsessed with it, and that's a good thing. So the other thing he's, to say the least, interested in is getting our economy back to where it should be, and saving jobs and all that kind of thing. So anything that has to do with trade or our internal economy is hugely important to him. So the Arctic is hugely important to him. You know, clearly the Coast Guard owns it, in my view, relative to the United States' presence up there. You know, frankly, the Coast Guard owns the Caribbean, the Eastern Pacific, the South Atlantic, as well as the, and I know that we're already looking at better vessels, different vessels to engage in the Arctic. And, you know, we all hope that everyone that has interest in the Arctic plays by the international rules and just, you know, uses the Arctic in a way that everyone can benefit. But that's, we all know, not always the case. But I think I know that the president's, and therefore my perspective on the Arctic is U.S. presence, U.S. use, and obviously a very, very fragile environmental region, so we have to play good stewards of the environment as well. And as I don't have to tell people like you, there are people on the planet, some of them very economically powerful, that don't care too much about the environment. I think that's one of the challenges we'll have, is to make sure everyone understands and plays by the right rules up there. But it's important. It's important to the president, certainly is important to me, and it's fundamental to what you'll all be doing in the future. Just, you know, buy big coats and stay warm. How many of you have served up in the Arctic off and on over the years? Yeah, a lot of people. I mean, it's kind of what you all do, yeah, for sure. Yeah, we got some good the Commandant's got some great shipbuilding plans, and a lot of support for cutters, not cutters, well, cutters too, but breakers up there. The one thing we all hope, that it's not militarized in a foolish way. And unfortunately, I think we're looking at some of the, well, Russia being a little bit more militarizing the zone, and it doesn't really have to be. Everyone can benefit by the Arctic, but we'll see where that goes. Great question, thanks.
In addition to the live questions, you have the option of texting in your questions. Instructions are on the screen.
Good afternoon,
Yes,
Mr.
sir.
Secretary. My name's Alan Bumgardner. I work in the Office of Contract Operations. One of the things that's been talked about around water coolers and the Coast Guard for as long as I can remember is why Congress never moved us to DOD. And so the question I'd put to you, and obviously you'd be biased
'Cause I think
as
you're lucky. Go
Secretary of
ahead.
Homeland Security, but back when you were in uniform, if you had to testify before Congress and give them a reason why we should have went to DOD, what would you tell them, and what would you tell them now?
I'm at a loss to even guess what the water cooler talk is about. I would tell you from a service that for almost its entire existence fought, I mean, these days are gone by for us as a Marine Corps, but for the first 150 years of our existence, we fought to not be done away with. We were small. We are, in fact, the best of the four services in DOD, without question. But we fought for 150 years not to be folded up and assimilated or absorbed into some of the other services. Until fairly recently, 150 years, our aviation element, as an example, which is fundamental to the way the Marine Corps fights, was always at risk because, the idea Air Force wanted all the assets, and if they couldn't have them all, they at least wanted there to only be two Air Forces, the Air Force and the Navy. So you are small but mighty. I think that there's advantages to maybe going into the DOD. I couldn't list very many of them, but the one threat, I would say, the one caution would be you're small, very, very focused on certain missions, very good at, incredibly good at those missions, but there's always that tendency in a large bureaucracy like DOD, and it is huge, that particularly when budgets are tight, to say, well, why do we have, I mean, this would be heresy to me, but why do we have a Navy and a Coast Guard in DOD? Why don't we just, so I think I'd be cautious and would really have to study that issue long and hard. I think certainly there's great advantages now to being in DHS. I mean, I love you as long as I'm, in charge, and I can't imagine this would be any different than anyone else that would be the Secretary of Homeland Security, that you are, it's great having a military force so you can be used in a way that supports the home game. If you look at it, and again, I hope I'm not going down a wrong road here. I don't know what the Commandant's position is, but if you look at the home game, the home naval game right now, there is zero U.S. Navy presence in the Caribbean, unless they're just, meandering through to go through the ditch. Zero in the Eastern Pacific. It's all in Asia or in the Middle East, Europe, Mediterranean. If we didn't have the United States Coast Guard doing what the United States Coast Guard does, playing the home game, we would be in a lot more trouble than we are. I mean, when I was in Southcom, I said this repeatedly, never knowing I'd have this job. And now that I have this job, I say it constantly, and that is the defense of our homeland, the southwest border, the Rio Grande border, starts about 1,500 miles south in the Caribbean and in the Eastern Pacific. And your current commandant, our current commandant, since he's been the commandant, has done phenomenal things to broaden that engagement with Mexico that forever didn't want to play with the United States Armed Forces. Today it's routine. The friendship is deep and broad. Partnering with, well, all of the nations, but Colombia as well, even countries that we don't get along with very well. What this commandant, what this organization has done in terms of partnering in pushing out our borders, because if we're trying to deal with the kind of problems that you all intercept 1,000 miles away from the southwest border, if we're trying to deal with all of that on our southwest border, we have lost the game, because you just can't win a game doing a 1-yard goal line stand every day, day after day. So, and that would be my fear, that if you were in, if the Coast Guard was in DOD, you'd get siphoned off to do missions that they see as more important. And while I'm on that topic, one of the things, and I would offer this to to you all in just your own conversations and your perspective. For many, many years, we thought of the defense of the homeland as the away game, the Cold War, Vietnam, that kind of thing, containment of communism here, there, and everywhere. So it probably did make sense to talk in terms of defense and non-defense initiative spending, that kind of thing. We live in a very, very different world today, and we need to, I think of our nation's security as just that, security, which encompasses defense as well as, well, it encompasses the away game, DOD, and the home game, DHS. That's how I think of it. So the idea that we can only worry about ISIS as a national security threat over there makes no sense, because they are here. The idea that, in my view, that we don't look at this massive importation of drugs into the United States as a law enforcement issue as opposed to a security issue. Since 9/11, we lost tragically 3,000 roughly Americans, mostly Americans, on 9/11. And since then, from terrorism, we've lost, I think, something in the neighborhood, and again, it's a tragedy, but something approaching 100 people, and 9/11 was, what, 16 years ago. If you look at narcotics and the networks that bring it to the United States and move it around the world, if you look at that as terrorism, like certainly our Latin American and Central American brothers and sisters do, if you look at that as terrorism, it's 650,000 Americans have died since 9/11. And this year, 54,000 died. Next year, 54,000 will die. The year after that, and the year after that, and the year after that. So if we don't have a force like you, in my view, like you, working the close fight, and it's close is a relative term, again, thousands of miles south of the United States, not to mention what you do on the inland waterways, not to mention what you do in the St. Lawrence Seaway and tucked up against our coasts, that would be in jeopardy, I guess, is my point. So it's a great question. Again, I hope I'm not raining on anyone's initiatives here, but that's where I would see it. Commander, Chaplain, how are you?
I'm good, sir. Thank you for being here.
Sure.
I'm Chaplain Judy Milana, and I'm a Navy chaplain.
Of course.
Serving with the Coast Guard and the wife of a combat Marine veteran. So, sir, I thank you for your leadership to the Marine Corps, but certainly now. My question has to do with people. So as you're going out and about to the different components, I'm curious about your perception about the individual serving in DHS, but then also what would be some good leadership principles and things that we could learn to help care for our people and help build resilience in the organization?
That is a great question. My sense, I know it's a little different to this organization because you're a military force, and you lead each other and lead your subordinates, and you're led by people who understand leadership. I mean, one of the things that once you get out of the armed forces and get into maybe something like I'm doing, this idea that from the day you join, you are being led by someone, right? And from the day you join, as you're led by someone, you are learning how to lead. And I think I'd say in my life, 90% of the people that led me were great men and women. And it was 5%, maybe they're around that I didn't like and they weren't particularly good leaders. But I actually learned a lot about leadership from the bad leader or the ineffective leader. But in my time in the Armed Forces and the Marine Corps, I was blessed with having been led by people that were really superior folks. And my other thing on leadership is I say this oftentimes, certainly in my past life, you can lead people to do absolutely anything you want them to do. All you have to do is train them and make sure they understand you care about them, and you can make them do anything you want them to do. In my world, the most irrational thing you will ever do is when there's shooting, when there's gunfire, when there's artillery, to move into it. That's the most irrational thing a human being can do. But they will do it without hesitation, every single time. I would say in your worlds, the most irrational thing you can do is jump out of a helicopter in a raging sea to save a life, but routinely done by the United States Coast Guard, or to go out into all of the other dangerous sea states and everything else to do what you do. So leadership is fundamental to everything. And as I say, you can lead people to do anything, but you got to take care of them. You got to make sure they understand that they have your back, that you have their back, and they will do anything you want. And there's all sorts of styles of leadership. This surprises people when I say it, but I was 45.5 years in the Marine Corps, a couple of years enlisted. I didn't get out really, but I was a sergeant, then transitioned, went to college, became an officer. And, you know, I never intended to stay past. In fact, like probably everyone that goes to boot camp, certainly Marines, standing at my first day, my first hours at Parris Island, South Carolina, the only thought I had was, what the hell have I done? What have I gotten myself into? I never intended to stay, and I always said to myself, I'll stay as long as it's fun, as long as it's, I think I'm making a difference. That's a key point. I'll stay until the Marine Corps tells me to go. And I just happened to stay in for 45.5 years and made 4 stars. But I made 4 stars not because I'm particularly good, but because everyone that ever led me showed me how to lead, mentored me, took care of me, and I translated that down, I guess, without realizing it, to people that I led, and they made me look good every single day. And so that's why I was a success, if 4 stars is a success. If you take the Coast Guard off, because the Coast Guard's a military service and understands military leadership, if you take them out of the equation for a second, DHS has got the worst morale in the United States government. And that's a shame, and that should not be like that because of the job that the DHS does. A good portion of DHS is made up of really, really brave men and women who do very dangerous things. Secret Service, Border Protection, CVP, and ICE, as an example. They should have, but the whole organization should be proud of what it does, but for some reason, it's got the worst morale in the federal government. Yet this is crazy. I get around and talk to people, and everyone I talk to, from every component of the organization, really likes what they do. Likes the people, they like the people they're working with, whether it's the office worker up at the NAC, and the NAC's a pretty tough place to like, but whether it's an office worker that they're sitting with, or a couple of Secret Service agents that are standing watch over the president, or down on the border with CVP, they all like what they're doing, they like the people they're serving with. So I don't know why in the polling that they come up at the lower end, not the lower end, the bottom of the morale pile. And I say I don't know why, I do know why. Because for a long, long time, I've had engagements, some of them fairly heated, with members of Congress saying, bringing this up to me, and I say, well, you do know I've only been here 30 days at the time. You do know I've only been here 2 months, right? I mean, this is not, and I'm going to fix it. I'm not going to fix it. We're going to fix it. And it starts with people understanding that the job they do is important, that people that criticize them better have a real reason to criticize them, otherwise they ought to shut up, and that I got your back. And so we're going to work to change that. But the people factor, there's nothing more important than people. The technology doesn't matter. The ships are nice, but they don't operate unless, and the mission certainly isn't accomplished unless the people do it. And I go back to it every time. You've got to, you can get people to do anything you want. As I say in the Marines, they'll take Iwo Jima, or they'll shine their shoes and make their bed. You just have to lead them. So that's what I'm going to do the best I can to do. I'm a kind of a get out and about kind of guy. As I say all the time, I like to get out and kick the tires and look behind the dumpsters to see, because that's how you really can get a sense of what a unit's all about. You can't do it, God knows, from Washington. So out and about is what I do right now. You probably know that the president has kind of a focus right now on the southwest border. So I'm working that hard. A couple of EOs came out that complicated my life immeasurably a couple of months ago. But I've been down on the border, and when you go down on the border and talk to the men and women of CVP, as an example, in McAllen, Texas, in El Paso, in Nogales, Arizona, San Diego. Talk to them. By the way, if you talk to the law enforcement people, I see them as kind of pretty important to what we do as well. You talk to law enforcement men and women, sheriffs and whatnot, and the mayors along the border. You get a very, very different view of what's needed and what they want than if you appear at a hearing on Capitol Hill. So I don't know if that answers your question, but the people. And to the degree that I can, we're going to make this organization much more happy about who they are. And I will defend people. I mean, you are not going to screw with my people. I will defend them and obviously hold them accountable if they make mistakes. That's part of what we do as leaders. But I think to date on the morale issue for the department, it's been mostly people criticizing us. You know, what's the number one criticism I hear all the time about the Department of Homeland Security? Who might guess what it is? The number one thing. What is it? TSA, yeah. And members of Congress will say to me all the time, as if they're going to change, they'll say, hey, you know, General, whatever, Secretary, they'll say, hey, listen, you know, you have a great organization, but TSA, I went through National Airport, and I'm a member of Congress, right? And I went through, and I not only had to take my shoes off, but I had to take my belt off. And I said, well, let's see, you're here, right? Well, yeah. And you didn't die in a flaming ball from 40,000 feet at 550 miles an hour to crash on the ground, right? You didn't. Would you like that? Is that the future you look for? Take your belt off and your shoes. It's crazy. That's the number one thing. So I think you have to defend the force. If there is an issue, again, an individual infraction or something, just like you all know this, you hold people accountable. But in the meantime, how about saying nice things about us when we don't have airplanes that crash and airplanes that explode in the sky? How about saying good things to us about saving people when we save them? So, okay, here's one up front.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, my name is Lieutenant Stephanie Young. The address right now is being live streamed, and we have mobile technology where people can ask questions. We have a question that came in from somebody not here. The question is...
That's a really safe question.
It's very safe, Mr. Secretary.
If it's a tough question, I want to know their name.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for your time today. How do you define success for the United States Coast Guard?
You're successful, again, good question. You're successful, you demonstrate success every day. So long as you're out there doing the mission you're doing and accomplishing the mission you're accomplishing, that's success. And certainly you do it every single day. I can't, you know, one of the things the Commandant and the others were telling me, the leadership were telling me before I got here, I mean, the morale of this organization, the retention rate of this organization, the number of people that can't get in this organization because of the talent, you know, the level of talent you shoot for, both in the enlisted ranks and the officers, that tells you worlds about the United States Coast Guard. The retention rate alone is just phenomenal. The number of people on average that stay for 20 years and beyond. So that tells me that you all like what you do and see your lives as meaningful. So I guess failure for this organization would be dirty waterways, hundreds of tons of cocaine getting into the United States, hundreds and hundreds of people every year not being rescued. I guess that would be failure. So since you're doing all of those things in spades, success is keep on doing what you're doing. You are defining success every single day. So that's, I don't need a name. That was a good question. Down front. Yep.
Good afternoon, Mr. Secretary. Jess Behara of Office of Aeronautical Engineering. So my question is more about a previous question. We hear a lot about the land border in the media, but not so much about the maritime border. And I would ask, they talk about the 19-foot wall and someone would just have a big market for the 20-foot ladders. Well, I would say the 20-foot boats as well.
Yeah.
So how successful are we at conveying that message to the administration about the importance of the maritime border And then how receptive is the administration to that message?
I would tell you this, that in the first days of being the Secretary of Homeland Security, I got a call that this evil empire, that sometimes evil empire, OMB, had just cut $1.2 million, $1.3 million, something like that, out of the Coast Guard budget, and totally shocked us over at Homeland Security. And I had to run faster than your vice to get over to the White House, because he was already there holding people hostage. And on that very short conversation, after he literally scared them, they're all hiding under the table, I said, look, I got it, you're new, you didn't know what you were doing, I'll make good the money this year, don't worry about it, but never again. What they didn't understand, I believe, is the importance. I don't mean the whole White House, I don't mean Donald Trump, I mean just one person either didn't understand or might be the only person on the planet that doesn't like the United States Coast Guard. But that won't happen again. Now, the point about the borders, you're right. Right now, the focus on the southwest border is, right now, it is our worst border. It's our most open border. We got tens of thousands of illegal immigrants coming up from Latin America, but they just come up this network starts in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Africa, Asia, North Korea, believe it or not. I don't know how, the toughest thing in the world must be to escape from North Korea. So getting into our country illegally must be really easy. But right now, the southwest border represents the vast majority of the illegal immigration, 95%. 100%, generally speaking, of the cocaine, 100% of the heroin, and a huge percentage of the methamphetamines come up through the southwest border. There's no doubt about it. When we increasingly secure the southwest border, whether it's with a wall or whatever, that pattern will change. It always changes. From the drug thing, the real solution to the drug problem is demand reduction in the United States. So long as there's a market, and there's a huge market, so long as there's a market, it's going to keep coming and generating unbelievable profits. And those profits are available to kill people, intimidate people, anything. But that's one huge threat. The other huge threat are the folks that come up. Now, that said, since Mr. Trump has taken over and I've become secretary, and a lot of things have, some initiatives that we've put in place, we've caused a great deal of concern by people, particularly from around the world, that would be wanting to come to the United States. They spend, and they're mostly relatively poor people. They're not bad people as a group. I know why they want to come to America, because their countries aren't as good, to put it bluntly. There's other words I could use, but still, legal is legal, illegal is illegal. But because we have changed the environment relative to illegal immigration, mostly by the election of Mr. Trump, and then some of the things we've already started to do down on the southwest border, the illegal immigration movement has been reduced in the last 2 months by 70%. 70%. Normally, January, February, March are big increases. It's after the holidays, the weather's getting better, and that's when the big increases start. It tends to die off November, December, and then it really picks up. And instead of picking up, we're at 17-year lows. Now, why is that important? It's just not important for us as a country to maintain our borders properly, legal, illegal. But the network these people move on is just awful. If you are a woman moving on that network, it takes about 4 weeks. If you are a woman on that network, you will be raped at least once. It's not a question of being raped, it's a question of how many times. If you are a young, healthy man coming up that network, you have a real chance of being siphoned off into the cartels in Mexico, or siphoned off into the organ harvesting business. Now think of that. Everyone's got a heart, everyone's got 2 lungs, everyone's got kidneys. That's another thing we don't talk about, but that's So to me, it's a human rights thing to keep people at home. I've interacted with the political leadership in Central America. I know them and appeal to them. Tell your people to stay at home. I've interacted with the evangelical leadership in those countries. I always do. I always did when I was at Southcom, the Roman Catholic leadership. Keep your people home. On top of that, or another aspect of that is, we, DHS, sponsoring a very large conference on prosperity in Miami in June, focused on the Central American republics. We're bringing Mexico in, Canada, Colombia, United States, obviously, Spain, Eastern European Union, to essentially an investor conference with the presidents of those countries to try to solve the real reason they leave. And the real reason they leave is just no economic opportunity. So just by what we're starting to do, we haven't laid 1 foot of wall yet, but just by what we've been talking about doing, we have cut down the illegal immigration by nearly 70%. On top of that, you have people from other parts of the world, Africa and Middle East, who are in Mexico, that now understand that the environment inside the United States is not friendly towards illegal immigration. Remember, our country takes in 1.1 million people a year legally. 1.1 million people. Those people wait generally between 6 and 10 years, and then they come in. And they are taken in as legal residents initially, and then ultimately they can seek citizenship. 1.1 million people a year. So we're not anti-immigration, but we are anti-illegal immigration. So the point is, because the atmosphere inside the United States is now understood to be not soft on illegal immigration, many of these individuals now want to stay in Mexico. Not their first choice, but want to. And Mexico is a great country, but America's better. Or they want to go to Canada. So this is working, and as I say, this network is phenomenally dangerous. It's awful for the people that move on it. The other thing that we know how things are changing, the traffickers typically 3 months ago would charge an individual about $3,000 or $4,000 to move here to move up into the United States from Honduras. They're now charging roughly $12,000, and they can't afford it. The people that we're talking about can't afford that kind of money. And why are they raising the price? Because instead of, when we captured the traffickers, coyotes as they're called, instead of releasing them, we're now prosecuting them. And you go down and talk to the CVP people on the border, they would have, they can tell you stories about catching traffickers 2 or 3 times a month for years. And when a Mexican is captured inside the border, if given the option, you're given the option of either going into detention or going back to Mexico, they all say, I'll go back to Mexico, naturally. So that's having an effect as well. But the maritime borders are always at risk. That's why you exist. CVP at the ports, the relationship there is, those are brothers and sisters on the other side of the mission of protecting the ports. But as we get successful in the South American, Latin American, Central American vector, drugs and people will come from another direction, and that's maritime. So, long answer. Maybe one more.
Mr. Secretary, actually, sir, we're right at time.
We're out of time?
Yes, sir.
No, we're not. We got one more question.
One more question would be great.
One more, no? Here you go. Brave warrant officer.
Mr. Secretary, Chief Warrant Officer Durant, Enlisted Personnel Management. What is your strategy going forward in continuing that we ensure, or in continuing that we can, ensuring that we continue to receive the budgets that we need to continue to operate, rather than seeing these stressful moments every single year where we're operating on continuing resolution?
Well, the 2 things would be this changing the discussion a little bit to security of the nation, not defense and non-defense. And I think that once we do that, so the more you can say that, and I know the Commandant is saying it as well, but the more you can say that, the better position we are to argue for what we need, first issue. Second issue, I think, and I beat this, when I was in Southcom, I beat this drum. I could not have done my job in Southcom in terms of drug interdiction. Could not have done it without the Coast Guard. Could not have done it. It would have been a complete waste of time without you all doing what you do. And so that has to be emphasized more and more, that, you know, the United States Coast Guard is certainly a military service for sure. Everyone should know that. Not everyone knows that. And the role that the United States Coast Guard plays, either, depending on how you look at it, either the last ditch defense of the nation in the homeland or the first line of defense, depending on how you look at it. And if we put it in that perspective, not to mention, you know, whatever causes the warming, the Arctic is getting more and more open, and that's a place where the U.S. Navy just is not set up to play. And you are, without question, the force of choice, the naval force of choice up there. So we need to, I will pound that, and we will start a long way out talking about the Coast Guard budget this next time around. And one false move with OMB, and I'm going to bring the vice back up there. And he can beat him with the stick. You still have the stick, right, Chuck? Yeah. So anyways, Commandant, thanks for the opportunity. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for what you do. Incredible organization, as I say, and in my heart as a Marine, I am not ashamed to say that we were once rescued on a terrible, terrible fight in Guadalcanal. If anyone else had rescued us by the Coast Guard, I wouldn't admit to it. Thanks for doing what you do. Appreciate it.
Thank you, lady. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Please take your seats.
Mr. Secretary, on behalf of the 88,000 men and women, and some of them are joining us remotely here this afternoon, I want to thank you for taking time out of your schedule to visit with, this is really the lifeblood of our Coast Guard here today. Now, we're all here at a headquarters unit. We would much rather be out there on the front lines, but we could not do what we do on the front lines without what all of us do here today. What you did not ask, and I was hoping you would, is, well, what's going on with the civilian hiring freeze? The Vice Commandant and I have been working this, as has the Vice Admiral Stowes, because we could not do what we do without all of our civil servants serving today as well. And when we look at the Department of Homeland Security, it is mostly civilian. We are that small military component out of 230,000 plus. But rest assured, I will speak for the Secretary. He said he's got your back. He's got your back. So again, Secretary, thank you again for having our back and being here today.
The Commandant, Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard, on behalf of the men and women of the U.S. Coast Guard, will present this framed memento to Secretary Kelly in recognition of his induction as our Service Secretary.
Thanks again. Take care of each other.
Attention on deck.